Hi, everyone. Today we're here for part two of the interview with clinical psychologist Dr. Gomez. Last time we talked about the details of clinical psychology and the career. Today we'll talk a little bit more about that as well as some of the specifics of the techniques used in clinical psychology. So Dr. Gomez, you talked to us in a little bit more detail last time about the workflow of a clinical psychology session. Could you give us a brief refresher before we dive into some of these techniques?
Most standard psychotherapy sessions are, regardless of kind of what people are doing, and we call it the 50-minute hour. You see that for kids and adults. What we mean by that is if I have patients scheduled at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and so on, I'm not doing 1 to 2, 2 to 3. I'll do 1 to 150 with a 10-minute break, reset, and then I get 2 o'clock, I start my next session. And then that's a little bit different if you're doing group therapy. Group therapies may run like a couple of hours, like 2 or 3 hours. But that's a kind of standard workflow, is like this hourly kind of rate, which is kind of weird when physicians will say, well, I can see like 5 patients in an hour. It's like, well, that's different than, because we're doing a lot more deeper work and it takes us a little bit longer to kind of get into the minutia nuance of the human brain. And so that's kind of broad picture what a session looks like. A CBT session in that hour or 2 hours will look really different than something like a parent-child interaction therapy session or a dialectical behavior therapy session. So that's where we get inside differences of what goes on within that 50-minute hour or that group format. But that's kind of standardized and pretty common across different types of psychotherapies.
CBT is one of the most common things kind of mentioned even in medical school, but we don't really understand or aren't really taught like the details of CBT. And I'm sure a lot of the general public doesn't really know what CBT involves. So what exactly is CBT and how is it conducted? What tools or practices are used as part of this kind of modality?
Yeah. And so CBT used to, back in the 70s, be a unitary thing. I actually call it the alternative rock metaphor for CBT. So back 90s, alt rock was Nirvana, Pearl Jam. Right. There's like only 4 or 5 bands. Now, alt rock can be anything from like Mumford and Sons to like, Foo Fighters to like Edward Sharpe to like, it can be really, those are really, really different sounds. Right. But we'd all probably say, I guess that's alt rock. Sounds like, or rap or hip hop. Same thing. Right. It's like Grandmaster Flash is also up in there, with, Wu-Tang Clan. Really different types of hip hop. And so back in the day, hip hop, like a couple of people, right? Mostly based kind of like New York City, LA. Now it's all over the planet, and you got, K-pop, and so there's all these mixtures of it that go on. And so it gets really confusing, even from a technician, like someone who does CBT, when people say it, because it's not a proprietary term. Some CBTs are. So if you say that you are certified in dialectical behavior therapy, which is a kind of an iteration, you better have the paperwork to back it up. But if someone says, I can do CBT, they can say that and not get sued. Versus like if you said, I do healing arts, that's pretty safe. You can do acupressure. I'm a cardiologist. You better have a medical license to back that up. And so that makes it even more confusing. But the general idea is pretty simple. And I wanted to kind of go into that and kind of what that is, if that would be okay. Mm-hmm. So CBT is a pretty simple idea. And one of my colleagues, her name is Dolores D. Bigfoot, she's a Cato Nation elder, and is with my mentor, Susan Schmidt, co-created the Honoring Children, Mending the Circle model, which is an adaptation of trauma-focused CBT for Native American Alaska Natives. She calls CBT old wisdom. And so you see CBT ideas in literate and pre-literate cultures. You see it in Buddhist manuscripts 2 centuries before Christ was born, across time, space, culture, geography. And essentially, this is what it is. Thoughts affect feelings, which affect behavior, which affect your consequences. That's it. You experience a situation, like the Stoic philosophers described this, Socrates described this, your grandpa probably described this. Like, think before you act, boy. Or like, don't be guided by your anger. Like, don't act out of anger. Like, that's a CBT phrase. Doesn't mean like, maybe your grandfather would have made an amazing cognitive behavior therapist. But I think the genius of CBT is that it's not something new. It's something very, very old and ancient. Okay. However, when we say it's simple, we mean like An 85-year-old great grandmother with a third grade education should be able to understand this idea, right? But it's also simple in the way shooting free throws is simple. LeBron James gets paid way more to throw a free throw than I do, mainly because the Lakers don't return my calls. That's the only reason. And so I'm going to show you a couple of ways in which this can get really difficult, not complicated, but just difficult. So kids I work with, they've heard the following, like, don't hit. Just don't hit, Billy. How hard is this? Don't hit. If a kid could do that, they wouldn't be in my office. You may hear someone say this, why are you so angry? You need to control your anger. Just stop being angry. And like, can you go from super angry to super happy without substances? I can, and I'm a doctor. I should be, but I can't. So what we're saying is door number 1 is closed, door number 2 is closed. Can you literally take 1 second break, 1 Mississippi, to think about how this is going to affect your consequences? Yeah, that's a little bit easier, not easy, but easier door to walk through. So another kind of example I give is one of my friends I went to grad school with. Like I asked people, and people watching this can say, it's, as we're filming this, it's around January, New Year's resolution time. And so people are like, I'm going to get fit, eat healthy, lose weight, right? Well, eating healthy and working out and losing weight is good for you. It's not a medical revelation we just gave the audience. Those of you who the first week of January did that New Year's resolution, like, holla girl, healthy lifestyle. Like, look, your tracker says you're at Wendy's. Okay. Like, yeah, you're having a smoothie. Dude. Like, yeah, you probably felt good. So why don't you do it? And the answer is it's really hard, right? It's really hard to do that. So one of my friends I went to grad school with wanted to learn Swedish, and they did. And that's the end of the story. And I hate him. I hate him more than he's like a brother. I'd take a bullet from him. I hate it so much. It's like, it's really weird. People who can just think, I'm going to change my behavior and do it are really weird people. And none of us like them, right? They frustrate the rest of us who don't do that. I wanted to learn Korean one time for no reason. And I was like, Game of Thrones is on, dude. Let me just forget it. Like, come on, Tyrion, don't die. I just got distracted. I just I don't know. It's not too important now. Behavior change is hard. And that's what we're saying is you can't do CBT without the B or the E, because another myth is that it doesn't have anything to do with emotion. No, emotion is a big factor. It can cue you to what's going on in your brain, what's going on in your body, what your actions are going to be. And so a big misconception of CBT is just like you think happy thoughts, you're good. Like, you fix the thought, you go. And it can be presented that way erroneously. But, for people, and you may try this with me, Adnan, I ask people to cross their arms just like they normally would. So they cross their arms. If you're watching this, feel free to cross your arms. Okay, and stay there for a second or two. And then now I want you to uncross and cross them the opposite way. And now some of the people watching this may be doing old school 90s Macarena. But once people have it the opposite way, I ask them to stay there for about 30 seconds. And then tell me how it feels. And usually my favorite is like, it feels weird, it feels odd, my favorite response is like against God. It's like wrong, it's just wrong. Yeah, it feels weird. And when we ask you to take a second break, 1 Mississippi, challenge your distorted thinking, and then act based on clearer thinking, that feels weird. And if people could do that, they wouldn't be seeing me. And now, if you need to recross your arms, you can do it in the correct way. But it's a muscle. So CBT is more like cardio than carpentry. That's the short version. It's more like gardening than it is like, metal work. There's a famous Native American legend. Anyone who's seen New Mutants, the Marvel movie New Mutants, the whole movie's about this. It's the story of the wolves, the two wolves. Or the two bears is another way it comes out. And it's a Native American parable. And the story is, I'll use the two wolf version. There were two wolves. One of the wolves was very angry and very violent and very cruel. And they would kill the farmer's livestock, mess up their crops. And one time the two wolves almost killed the farmer's 2 daughters. There was a second wolf. And that wolf was very noble and kind and compassionate and strong. And that's the wolf who actually protected the farmer's daughters from the other wolves. So that's why they didn't get hurt. And so it's kind of a riddle. And the riddle is, which wolf survives? And the answer is the one you feed. And that's CBT. That's the clearest kind of example. And that's a Native American legend. And we consider that very paradigmatic CBT. Now, the other part of this is there's a big misconception about, and I think it comes down to what thoughts are, because in CBT, we believe thoughts are actually three things, and I'm going to show them right now. So and I'm going to use I'm from West Texas. I'm going to use a very West Texas metaphor, storm clouds. If you grew up in West Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, like 9-year-old kids are like, you see that rotation there, that's a good echo hook, F2, F3. That's a 9-year-old kid who grew up in Oklahoma. Their thoughts are actually three layers: automatic thoughts, intermediate beliefs, and core beliefs. And there's good news, bad news at each one of these levels. So good news, bad news for automatic thoughts. Here's the bad news. Automatic thoughts are very, 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 very fast. They're almost infinite. So unless we have like one of those flood kind of rains that you get every now and then, if me and you, Adnan, were standing outside and it started raining, this is what I would probably be like, hey, Adnan, did you? Yep, it's raining. And then I pull out my umbrella on like the 15th drop, right? So they're super fast, and that's the bad news. Good news is one of my colleagues who does trauma-focused CBT says automatic thoughts are cowards. Look them in the face, usually back down. Roy Van Tassel, one of our trainers, uses that phrase a lot, and I love it. Now, automatic thoughts are, you probably do this normally, and a lot of people watching this do. You might be the therapist for your family. Like, and I'm never going to get into grad school. In medical schools either, I'm not going to pass the MChat. Oh my God, Michael, shut up. You are so brilliant. You got this MChat locked down. You're going to get to great medical school. Right? You may be the person who does that for your peer group or your family. You're doing that with automatic thoughts. So you can kind of debate them a little bit. You can challenge their veracity, and they often go down if you do that. Now, the next level up, what I call storm clouds, good news, bad news is, the good news is the techniques you use to challenge these automatic thoughts, you can often use for storm clouds, but you need to stick with them long. They're a little bit stronger. That's the bad news. They bring a lot more resistance and a lot more strength to them. And the way you know you have a cloud is if you hear the following keywords: should, must, always, never, all the time, none of the time, everyone, no one. It sounds like a philosophy statement, right? And so if you hear that, you're in cloud town. So I'm going to give you an example from like a 10-year-old kid. So let's say 10-year-old kid in school, teacher comes up to this 10-year-old boy named Billy. Billy, you didn't do very well on this quiz. You failed. I know you're smarter than this, and I'm going to expect a much better performance for you at your next quiz. I know how smart you are, but you did not do well on this quiz. So going from automatic thoughts to core beliefs, here's what the cognitions look like. I freaking hate math. I'm always messing up because I'm stupid. And for storm cells, core beliefs, we also call them schemas or themes. The good news is they're finite. Jeff Young, who is a faculty at the Beck Institute, has a book called Schema Therapy, and identifies about 24 core beliefs. So they're finite. You're usually only dealing with a couple or like one. The bad news is, whereas automatic thoughts are cowards, core beliefs are ex-cons who got released from the state penitentiary yesterday for 3 counts of aggravated assault. Okay? They do not back down. And the last thing I'll say in this is you can map that thought structure neurologically. Automatic thoughts are mostly neocortex. Core beliefs start connecting to your limbic system, and like intermediate beliefs connect to your limbic system, and core beliefs are almost entirely limbic system with a little bit of neocortex to communicate them. And so this is like, I'll give you an example of a functional core belief. So those of you out there who have children, or like if you have a sibling or a parent that you really get along with. So full disclosure, as a child therapist, I don't have any children that I know of. But if those of you who do have kids, or if not, parent, sibling, here's the thought I want you to think. I want you to repeat this inside your head right now. I love my child, or I love my mom, or I love my dad. Repeat that, okay? Keep repeating it. Keep repeating it. If we put you under an fMRI machine, your neocortex is not the only thing that would light up. Hippocampus. Remember when your daughter or son was born? Remember, what your mom cooks for Christmas every Christmas? Remember that? The smell of that? That's not neocortex. That's deeper in your limbic system. Amygdala, the deep love you feel for your parent or your child, right? Now, if I said, hey, give me an analytic proof why you love your parent or your child, you could do it. It's a really bizarre question, though, right? It's like, I guess that's just a really weird question because it's not all neocortex. There's a deep limbic system. And as one of my CBT colleagues says, limbic systems don't have language capability. That's really here. That like it's hard for them to verbalize, right? Language capability is in another part of your neurology, right? And so that's why core beliefs, you can't just debate them. Okay. Now, where the storm cloud metaphor breaks down is as follows. It's actually bidirectional. That's where the metaphor breaks down, because a lot of people, when they do CBT really badly, they try to debate you out of your core beliefs. They may be right. Adnan, you're not stupid. Yeah, and yeah, I am. No, you're not. You're like in medical school. Well, I just got lucky. Well, I was a pretty smart person to be lucky. Well, I'm not going to get into residency. Right? We get this with depression, with PTSD, with anxiety, with eating disorders. And so, when a CBT, if a person who's not doing CBT effectively starts to debate them, they're not actually doing CBT, because we call that process of challenging and restructuring cognitions cognitive processing. It's a core technique in CBT. Some people would say it is the core technique. I would argue it's one of the more powerful ones, but not necessarily the entirety of it. And the way you do that effectively is you never instill certainty in any of those belief structures. You instill doubt. And I think that's the biggest misstep that they have. That's one of the hugest missteps. And so I'll give you an example. The best CBT or best cognitive processor I've ever seen in my entire career in 20 years is my Mexicana tia, my aunt here in West Texas. I'll give you an example of her CBT prowess. Ready? Hey, Thea, I'm going out tonight. Does this shirt look okay? That shirt? Yeah, it's okay, right? It's fine. What's wrong with the shirt, Thea? What's wrong with the shirt? You want to look like an idiot. You nailed it. Now, she may have borderline personality, Adnan, but that's not the point. Best CBT ever lived, because I have a ton of doubt. So I'm entirely doubting that. A kid version, like the best CBT in pop culture, is Olaf from the movie Frozen. If you want to see good CBT, watch Olaf in Frozen. So I'll give you that 10-year-old, like I'm stupid, or that 10-year-old, the math test kid. I'm stupid, Adnan. Why? I'm always messing up. Why? It's so mad. Why? Miss my mom. Really sad. Want to talk about it? Olaf's the best CBTer, right? So last thing for CBT, and then I promise I'll shut up for a second. This diagram, because these core beliefs come from somewhere, they come from your life experiences. So for example, tornadoes are much more likely atmospherically in West Texas just because of where we're at on the planet. Los Angeles, tornadoes are not really that common because of the atmospheric conditions in LA are just not conducive, right? And this also explains why high-risk people keep getting into the same situations. Okay, is this cycle, they come from somewhere. So to give you an example, let's take Janie, a 25-year-old Latinx female who lives in Sacramento, California, okay? So Janie was born in LA and then moved to Sacramento and then to Concord and then to San Diego and then back to LA, and she's now back in Sacramento, and she meets the same abusive D-bag every time. Like his name's Chad. That's the only there. It's like the same dude, right? Every time. Well, she got like a scent or something. Here's why. CBT explains that. Because when Janie was a young girl growing up, her father was an alcoholic and would tell her, you're stupid, you're fat, you're a cow, you're a pig, you're just like your mother. Okay? And so she comes to Sacramento. She gets back to Sacramento. And the first month she's there, she meets two gentlemen. She meets Adam and she meets Bob. Here's how Adam approaches Janie. Wow, you're really cool and really strong, and I think we got a lot in common, and I just kind of wanted to get to know you better because you seem really cool. Okay, that's Adam. Here's Bob. What the hell's wrong with you? You just look like a pig today. Did you even do your makeup? You even shower? God, you stink. Now, not as who is healthy for Janie, but who is more consistent with her life experience, who keeps her in homeostasis. Bob. Right? So the biggest misconception of CBT is that the theory has anything to do with health. It has nothing to do with health. It has to do with homeostasis. Your body, medicine, physiology has nothing to do with health. So it has to do with homeostasis. The reason you can't lose that 5 pounds is because your body thinks you're starving. So it tries to make you eat donuts, and you do because they're delicious, right? So CBT is about balance, and good CBT disrupts balance through doubt to create a new homeostasis that's much healthier for you. So it is about health, but the core concept is, how is this homeostasis working? And if we know that, we can then disrupt it for a healthier homeostasis. So last thing I'll say is, I'll give you an example of a 25-year-old female veteran I was working with doing CBT. She had done a lot of her trauma work, so now we're doing kind of more classic CBT, and she was basically pretty isolated. She didn't want a partner or anything. She identified as heteronormative, identified as female and heteronormative. And so the place she worked at was a gentleman named, well, I'll call him Adam. And in our session, I was saying, well, she's like, yeah, he keeps coming around me, like wanting coffee, wanting to, I just don't want to. I'm like, well, is he ugly? She's like, no. Like, you like him? Yeah, I think I kind of like him, but I want to go out. Well, why? She's like, because of all the stuff that happened. She's like, no, it's like just dangerous to be around men. It's like, well, is he dangerous? Like, and I've got to the point where I inserted some doubt. I said, well, it's coffee. Yeah. Well, why not? It's a date. It's not a date. It's a beverage. How about this? Get public place. This is pre-pandemic. So go to Starbucks. It's a really public place. Okay. Get your girlfriend to make sure you text you 10 minutes into that coffee date. And if it's going cool, great. Have her text you another 15. Make sure to do it just in case you can have an easy out. Say, oh my God, she got her car broke down. No, win-win, right? No risk for you. And if you have a good time, just keep sticking around after every 15 minutes. He's like, fine. Okay. And came back. Because the core of this is that there's a belief in CBT, especially through the Beck Institute, that which is one of the founding fathers of CBT, that therapy doesn't do crap to help you. What therapy does is it creates a window that you can get a corrective life experience. If life experiences created these and ripples down, then corrective life experiences will do the identical thing. And so we get windows where they can take advantage of corrective life experiences. And that's what Janie did. She went out, had a great time. I think they ended up getting much more serious and having a more permanent relationship. But her homeostasis says danger, males are danger. And she had really good data for that. At this point, this male was not dangerous for her. And she actually kind of liked this male. And so that's a kind of good concrete example of CBT and kind of how it works within that theory. So I will shut up there.
And so how do things like EMDR or dialectic behavior therapy or like flooding or exposure therapy, all these things work? Is it just more of like a case-by-case situation, or is it more like, if they have some kind of like specific like phobia, then you do more like flooding or exposure, and then if you have something else like some kind of borderline issue, then you do the dialectic, or how do you kind of approach things?
Yeah, so for going to kind of the exposure-based therapies, and a lot of treatments we do if you work with trauma, there's this kind of weird debate, well, exposure is better than cognitive processing. And when we do trauma-focused CBT, our thought is, let's do both. Kind of in that order, let's do gradual, not flooding exposure, but gradual. If you've ever like worked out for like a 5K or 10K, you've done gradual exposure work with your cardio. So like if you never run, I would say, all right, Adnan, 10 miles today. You'll die. So you haven't run really ever, Adnan. So let's do about half a mile this week, 3 times a week. Then next week we'll up you to maybe 3/4, and we're going to gradually build your tolerance and cardio. And so we do that and we have ways to check in. So like we'll do a 1 to 10 stress scale. So if I say the word rape and you were sexually assaulted, you may be at a 2 out of 10. You might be at a 9 out of 10. But in the goal of exposure is, when I talk to kids, I say it's a lot like stretching. It doesn't feel great, but if you hear something snap, Dr. Michael messed up, not you. And it's a very, very powerful tool, especially for things like when you get panic attacks related to, trauma or just to anxiety, like phobias or OCD. OCD is a completely exposure-based. There are OCD treatments that do cognitive processing, but usually they do that as post after they've done the exposure core. And so we do exposure. And then if they're still, because it's a lot of people who have distorted thinking, like what we call cognitive distortions in CBT, it's amazing how much they can process on their own once they're not having panic attacks, right? It's like, actually, when I say the word rape, I don't have a panic attack. Like, maybe it's not my fault either. Yeah. Now, sometimes they need an assist. So we just do them both and kind of in that order. We don't think you have to pick. But to answer your question, it's a different kind of means of change. And it's basically Phillips head screwdriver versus a flathead screwdriver.
And so how does trauma-based or trauma-focused CBT differ from general CBT? Is it more combining those cognitive processing and exposure-based therapies versus like some other conditions would be maybe focused on either one of them? Or is it pretty similar to general CBT for other issues?
Good question. One of our trainers she has a phrase that I think really sums it up in one sentence. Gradual exposure is the heart of TFCBT. So the gradual exposure we talked about is the heart of TFCBT. And it really is a good way to distinguish if someone's doing CBT, which is a wonderful modality, or TFCBT. So I could talk to you about relaxation skills and how to identify your affect and how to express emotion and emotion vocabulary and cognitive triangle. But I may never say the word sexual assault or, military combat, and that's just CBT. I can do the same thing, but when we talk about relaxers, we talk about, so Adnan, how did your body feel when you were in the firefight? When we talk about the cognitive triangle, give me some, we're not going to necessarily process them, but I just want to know what were some of the cognitions that were going through your head after the firefight. And so that would be a different mode. You can see how that's much more kind of, we're trying to do some gradual exposure within that. Another thing that separates it is that it's kind of a 3-phase. I kind of think of like a cake. So we call the first phase PRAC, which stands for psychoeducation and parenting, give information and help with parenting skills. So some CBT modalities don't involve the caregiver. A lot of them will, but ours, it's mandatory. You have to involve some caregiver. It doesn't have to be the biological parent, but basically it can be like a teacher. It can be an inpatient floor staff, a court-appointed special advocate. Relaxation regulation skills, affect management, and cognitive coping. That's where we teach a cognitive triangle. Then we do a narration process. We do a process of narration and exposure and processing. They actually talk about their story. And I think the biggest rookie mistake that a trauma therapist can make is day one, let's talk about your trauma, Adnan. Well, maybe you're able to, and maybe you're ready, but maybe you might need some skills, like some DBT skills, to be able to tolerate the massive amount of distress and self-harm ideation you have day to day. So let's give you those, and then we can do something exposure-based and then processing. And then the last part is we talk about, the rule of thumb is being heard, being recognized is the opposite of being traumatized. So me as your therapist hearing your story is very powerful, but if you can share it with your mom, her giving you the validation, that's really kind of where a lot of the power is. And another kind of difference is CBT therapists usually train in like safety skills and safety assessment. For a lot of our kids, we're doing that every session, like checking in on how much they're cutting, what skills we can use to replace their cutting behavior, things like that. So we kind of call it a hybrid model. Has a massive amount of research behind it, over 70 peer-reviewed studies, over, I think, 24 randomized controlled trials at this point. It's been done on every continent on the planet except Antarctica. And in our defense, there aren't a lot of kids in Antarctica. So, it's a pretty robust model that is also responding to a lot of the literature and a lot of our wisdom from doing 30 years of trauma work.
Since one of your specialties is problematic sexual behaviors, what exactly are some of these problematic sexual behaviors? And then what are the common causes for that? And then how are they treated?
Oh, good question. A good resource for this, for either a parent, professional, just someone who's curious about this, is the National Center for the Sexual Behavior of Youth. So www.ncsby.org. It's through my alma mater, University of Oklahoma, which houses the National Center for Sexual Behavior of Youth. And it really goes about a bunch of misconceptions. So one is I call, like, basically most people's misconceptions come from Law and Order. Now, I'm a massive Law and Order fan, especially SVU, and I miss Stabler more than I miss most of my relatives. But it does give you a lot of erroneous information. So most TV does. But again, Law and Order is amazing. And so one of the things, the shortest way I can explain when I talk to therapists and parents and providers is that we do not treat problematic sexual behaviors. We treat problematic sexual behavior. All of our data for 3 decades of looking at kids and adolescents who sexually act out show that it's a behavioral problem, not what we would call in the DSM or ICD a paraphilia. And so the model at OU has a 3% recidivism rate, which means they go through the full treatment, they reoffend sexually. It's a very successful program and very powerful. We've done it at multiple sites across the United States at this point, and some in Europe, like Britain. And so Dr. Jane Selewski developed the preschool and school age model. She is the Captain Kirk of the OU team. Dr. Barbara Bonner, who was former Captain Kirk, I guess Captain Pike for you Star Trek nerds out there, and was one of my mentors, developed the adolescent protocol in conjunction with other people like Mark Chaffin, Susan Schmidt, a lot of other really smart people. And so they both have equivalent recidivism rates. So about has about 3%. So it's really effective because what they found out was the things that don't work for child and adolescent sexual behavior problems are adult offender models, which look a lot like AA. Now, I'm not knocking AA. I know people both professionally and personally who benefited from it, but essentially that's not how it works. That's not effective for kids for sure. There's some data showing it's probably not effective for adults either. And so the fastest way, so I'll give you a detailed example. We had a TF-CBT therapist in Tulsa, a great therapist, wonderful clinician, and she was working on a trauma-focused CBT case, a trauma case, and it's a 12-year-old boy. And she comes, we're in the middle of the consultation series, like halfway through, and she comes on panic talking. It's like, Dr. Gomez, you remember, I don't know, you do the sex stuff with the kids. Like, whoa, don't you say, don't ever say sex stuff like that. As an aside, when I got back to West Texas, I thought I'd be the trauma guy because I'm one of the only people who works with kids who sexually act out because they scare people. I think it's a legitimate fear. People are worried about safety. They're actually relatively safe, especially with treatment. They're really safe. They can reintegrate really easily and effectively with no risk to the other population. But I thought as a trauma guy, in the first year I was back in West Texas, 3 child welfare workers said, hey, send her to Dr. Gomez's sex clinic. You know where he does the sex stuff? Please never say that. And they don't say it to my face anymore, Adnan, so I'm very happy about that. So this therapist is panic talking. I say, all right, slow your role player. Back up and tell me what happened. She's like, okay, my 12-year-old kid. Okay, same kid you've been doing trauma-focused CBT. I said, yeah. Okay. Walks down the playground, grabs a girl's breast. Okay. Yeah, another 6th grader. Okay. What happened immediately after? He laughed and ran away. And I was like, okay, so what's your question? Now her exact phrasing, we're going to swing back to this, is I don't work with perps. Okay, we're going to swing back to that. There's a problem with that language. And so, but I let it, it's like, okay, we're focused. And so I said, okay, so your question is like, you're kind of unsure what to do. She's like, yeah. I said, okay, let me give you a similar scenario. Same kids, same girls, same school, same time of day. Everything's literally the same, but one thing is different. Here's what's different. Instead of grabbing her breast, he walks up and pops her in the mouth and there's blood everywhere. What would you do? Goes to in-school suspension, loses specials, has to write an apology letter, no Xbox when he gets home. Like, sounds good, do that. Yeah, that's a behavioral problem. It's not a sexual problem. It's not a paraphilia. All of our data shows for 30 years that it's a behavioral problem. Actually, the core recommendation is supervision. Parents have to be watching their kid. They hate that recommendation. It's like, no, it's kind of like, how do I lose weight, Dr. Adnan? Exercise and change your diet. Anything else? No, that's what you got to do. They hate the recommendation. It's like a simple recommendation. There's nothing fancy, but people will try all these weird things because they don't want to do the fundamental. Now, I'm not saying that the parents don't want to do it, but a lot of providers don't want to do the fundamental thing. So to kind of touch base at your question, like kind of what causes it, it's really that lack of supervision. It's a behavioral problem. There was a study that very smart man, Dr. Benjamin Siegel, did at University of Arkansas with and Dr. Ben Saunders, I believe. And here was a study. They looked at coercive modeling versus sexual modeling. Like kids see sexual acts like pornography, or kids see coercive acts like violence. Now, and they were looking which one of those predicts, or how do they predict sexual acting out behavior, what we call PSB, problematic sexual behaviors. Now, short version is please do not show pornography to children, but if you put them toe to toe, coercive modeling way better predicts sexual acting out behavior than sexual modeling, which you wouldn't think of, right? But it makes sense because what is rape? Rape has nothing to do with sex. It has to do with coercion, dehumanization, power and dominance over another person, right? So when we consult with domestic violence shelters, we say, hey, you need to screen for PSB, problematic sexual behaviors. They're like, why? We tell them the study that the Arkansas team did. They're like, oh, that makes total sense, right? So we see a lot of kids. People will ask me, like, what kind of kids do you see? Well, I kind of see 3 groups. One are kids who have trauma, but statistically, they're the minority. Most kids who sexually act out do not have trauma. And if they do have trauma, It's not just sexual. Sometimes it is. But if a kid who's sexually acting out says, hey, Dr. Adnan, I wasn't sexually abused, they probably are telling the truth, which really shocks people. And it's like, oh man, that's surprising. But ask them, do daddy and mommy fight? Yeah, daddy slams mommy's face. Okay, guys, or child neglect. And so they forget to ask that. They're like, well, they weren't sexually abused. Well, ask for other traumas because they might have seen some coercive behavior like physical abuse or domestic violence or neglect. But they're the statistical minority. I think maximum 40%, and we're thinking it may be as low as 25% of the population. So all the kids who sexually act out, teens and children, might be as low as 25, but 40 is like the highest estimate we got. Now, the other group are kids who have like developmental disabilities. And I want to be very clear, having a developmental disability does not put you at risk to sexually act out. It does not. It's just the kind of kids I tend to see. And that might also be a skew for me specifically because I work a lot with kids with autism, intellectual disability, FAS. And so I tend to get those kids. So the question I'm answering is, what kids do you see? And what's your population breakdown? And that's what I see is kids with like, so we had a kid who 16 chronologically on a good day cognitively was like second grade. Take one guess at the age of this victim. 7. Because that's where he was cognitively, right? But puberty-wise, he definitely looked 16. And the third group are my favorites, Adnan. Delinquents. Dude, we busted you for the sexual assault. You're dealing, you're stealing, you're boosting cars, you're delinquent, you're true, like you're doing all this, you're gang affiliated, but we popped you for this one. And so a guiding rule of our treatment is caregiver participation is absolutely mandatory, which we get a lot of pushback. It's like, I didn't rape anyone, Adnan. It's like, we're not saying you did. We're not saying you're the problem. We're saying you're the solution. We're going back to supervision. And so we got to have that caregiver participation. The other one is you do not get out of our group or our treatment. It's not that you're not sexually offending. You have to be passing. If you have a learning disability, you got to get the testing and then accommodations. You have to be following the rules at home, following your probation, doing your community service. If you're old enough, getting a job, applying to college, like you got to be doing everything. We got you. So it's not enough that you're not just sexually offending. We want to look at, because it's a behavior problem. It's not the sexual stuff we're interested in. What's in your behavior that we're interested in? Okay. Last thing I'll say on this is Dr. Elizabeth Letourneau out of Johns Hopkins, who is a brilliant, brilliant mind in any field. And we are blessed to have her in the field of, this, what we're talking about. By the way, please don't call her Mary Kay Letourneau. She gets so angry at that. They're two different, way different people. Okay. Dr. Elizabeth Letourneau, one of the most brilliant people on the planet, and especially with this, has a talk. And there's a TED Talk. If you type in Elizabeth Letourneau TED Talk, you'll see her TED Talk. And she does a variation of this. And I've seen this done. And usually if we're dealing with this type of problem, we're talking to law enforcement, judges, probation officers. We're talking to the legal field. And so here's a very paraphrased version of this talk. So we're talking to a room full of cops, lawyers, attorneys, judges, right? If you could get rid of, completely resolve, minimum 1/4, maximum 40% of all perpetrators who sexually abuse children. And it's actually way less costly than what you're doing and completely ethical. Would you do it? Yeah, obviously. Are you sure? Yes. Really, really, really sure. Yeah. Then give them evidence-based psychotherapy with a CBT base. And then you see these judges and cops get so uncomfortable. Like, we need a registry. Dr. Letourneau kind of started her career showing that sexual offender registries actually don't work well. They usually don't do what they're supposed to do, and it's hard to upkeep them. They really aren't super effective for the most part. Therapy is. Evidence-based therapy, especially that with a CBT base or even DBT base, I would say, are really good and really effective and do prevent them from sexually acting out again in the future. So last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is people ask me how I got into this. How do you work with because it's a kind of a different skill set. And it's like it's not like they're not warm and fuzzy kids, right? They're, 15-year-olds who rape people, not the warmest, fuzziest kids. Here's how I got into it. I was in Oklahoma where they developed this model that I use and a lot of the people use across the nation. Dr. Barbara Bonner, who is one of my dear mentors and is a brilliant person. I was switching rotations I was on an internship, and it's like about this time of year, January. And Barbara asked me, she said, hey, do you want to do the adolescent group, the PSB group? My exact words to Barbara Bonner was, I don't work with perps, Barbara. I cannot believe I said that to her. Barbara does a very Barbara. So I'm like, oh, just give it a try. And so the group was held across the street from our Child Study Center in Nichols and Towers at the OU Health Sciences Center. Not people think it's safety, like, well, they must be no. It's because we have 2 boys groups and a unified parents group and a bunch of therapists. Boys group cap at about 15 boys, and that's 30 boys till. Then we have like a parents group that can be 30, 40, 50 parents. So it might be like 70 people in any way. It's just we don't have space there. The way you get there is you go up an elevator, and there's like this like 100-meter hall that you walk down because it's a conference center. And so I'm walking down the hall, and this is the first group I ever attended for this group. And this is 2010. Oh my God, that's a long time. And so that's when I started doing this work, is January 2010. In my brain, here's what's going on. Gonna go make Barbara happy. I'm a balanced man. I'm out. I don't work with perps. I work with victims. I also have my own lived experience. Like, forget these kids, man. They're pedophiles, right? Right? That was my head. I don't know what we talked about in that group that night. The only thing, there was kids 13 to 17 in that group. Here's what I remember in my brain. This is all I remember for that night, is the following. These are just kids, man. Oh my God, these are kids. Not monsters. They're not pedophiles. They're not like, I just wrote off a whole group of kids. I was so ashamed of myself. I felt so ashamed that I'd done that. Like, yeah, you did a stupid, wrong, hurtful thing. I don't think you deserve to go to jail at 13 to like 50, man. I don't know. I don't feel right about that, man. Especially if we haven't tried to help you. I felt so ashamed that I had just written off an entire group of kids. And so I had to do something to make it right. I was like, I can't do that. And that's why I still do work in this field, is because, yeah, they're kids. And all of our data shows they're not pedophiles. They're kids. They did something wrong and hurtful and deeply, deeply painful. But you're not a monster. You did a bad thing. You're not a bad person. You're not a monster. And the last illustration I'll give is part of the training team for OU, I did intakes. And I used to get this call all the time for kids like this, especially teenagers, from juvenile probation officers saying, Dr. G, you can't help this. Your kid's Hannibal Lecter. Dr. G, you're not going to be able to help this kid. Send him our way. Let's give it a shot. Won't hurt. This kid had his sexual offense occurred at about 12, 13, and he'd been basically inpatient for 3 years, right? Like locked down, like prison. And this kid was big. This kid was like, had a couple inches on me, looked like an Oklahoma farm boy. And he looks pretty flat. So I come in, and I already know his name, but, rapport, relationship building. I said, hi, I'm Dr. Gomez. What is your name? SO17, sir. Sorry, man, what'd you say? SO17, sir. Sex offender number 17. The unit he was at previously used a AA model. You have to admit you're a pedophile, because you are, right? So he was not allowed to use his name. He could only say SO17. Adolescence is the most formative period of identity development for primates. What do you think that kid thought he was? Right? Congrats, we created a sex offender. Great job, guys. So I paused. I said, okay, man, if you don't want to, that's okay, but we don't use that language here at our center. I'm gonna call you Billy. Is that okay? Like, yes, sir. Okay, let's restart this, man. Hi, I'm Dr. Gomez. What is your name? Billy. It's nice to meet you, Billy. Let's get started. That kid did amazing in the program. He did awesome. The offense he did was he touched his sister over the pants, over her dress. One time, to our knowledge and the investigator's knowledge, mom called the police, child welfare. It happened to be election year for that judge in that county, and they threw the book at him. And the reason he stayed so long in prison, basically, is because if you got in his face, he just hit you. So what inpatient staff aren't known for their, touchy-feely nature. And so he just kept getting extended over time till he got to our place. And he flew through our program. He did amazing, and we never saw him again. He was such a different kid at the end of treatment.
Moving on to another area of your expertise, autism. What is autism spectrum disorder, and how is it diagnosed and treated?
So the real world answer is you get some random person like, hey, you do this, so you have autism, or you like trains, or you look like Sheldon. So there's a sense in which sometimes I think that diagnosis is getting more accurate, but you can see like ADHD or stuff like that. It gets overdiagnosed. It also depends on what region. If like you're in a region with a lot of resources, like let's say you're in like, someplace like, Kennedy Krieger, Duke, UCLA, UC Davis, you'll probably get it less often. But if you're like mine, anyone can diagnose, any professional can really. And so the Temple Grandin, who's horse trainer, but he's a celebrity who has autism. And there's a Claire Danes movie that's called Temple Grandin, and then Temple Grandin does a TED Talk. And she talked, and I think she has the best one sentence definition of what autism is. Autism is a different mind. It's not like we're not disabled or we're not mentally ill. It's a different mind. It's a different way of seeing the world. So Temple Grandin builds horse corrals and cattle corrals and can do it at such a higher level than anyone on the planet because of how her brain works. And we call that neurodiversity. So that would probably be the one phrase that would kind of, encapsulate is like neurodiversity. But given that most people on the planet don't have that type of brain, it can make things really, really, really difficult for you, right? And so a way to kind of think of autism is it's a disorder of social communication. So what I mean by that is let me juxtapose it with linguistic communication. If, let's say I airdropped you into mainland China, Adnan, I'm assuming you do not speak Mandarin or Cantonese, you could get by. Like, hey, can you, the water, how do you say water in Cantonese? I don't even know. So you would have your social communication. Now, it would look quantitatively different. You may stand much closer or too far away, right? For someone who grew up in mainland China, so social space, but you know to stand like this way, not like this, right? Not like at a right angle, that'd be odd. And so the quantity of it would look different. Not the quality. So to give you an example of qualitative differences, and qualitative differences in social communication is a good way to think of autism. So they've done these studies and they with younger children where they do eye movements on a computer screen. So they're watching a video and they look at where the eyes go on the screen. They can actually track it and see where it's at, how long, what percentage, what intensity, right? And so short version of this literature is they looked at three groups: kids who are not neurodiverse, kids who are typical, kids with ADHD looking behaviors or actual ADHD, right? ADHD can be thought of as a quantitative difference in social communication, right? And ASD kids, autism spectrum disorder kids. And it was the video was this, a man and a woman having an animated, not a fight, but an animated discussion, right? And here's what the eye tracker saw. Kids who do not have autism, who are completely neurotypical, look here at the mouth and at the hands, the gesticulations, right? Kids with the ADHD looking behavior, look here, and at the gesticulations, but really, really fast, like squirrel, right? Kids with autism, there's equal dispersion. They are as likely to look at the eye as they are at my pin on my lapel, as they are at my left shoulder. They give no preference at all, which isn't technically a disability or, it's definitely not a pathology or mental illness, but it's a really different way of looking at the world, right? And a lot of people think autism, I also call autism a cake. Because people say, well, Anna, I think I have some autism because I just really like comic books. That's not ASD. You're a nerd, and that nerds are cool. But you have ASD. So autism is a very specific set of ingredients that go together in a very specific way to produce a very, very hyper-specific outcome. The reason I say autism is a cake is you never come home from the grocery store, arms carrying a bunch of groceries and drop them all. Like, oh my God, there's a German chocolate right there on the floor. I hate it when that happens, right? No, because that can't happen accidentally. There's a huge, obviously people like anti-vaxxer movement, which vaccines do not cause autism, red dye doesn't, gluten doesn't. And I rarely get this from a family when I'm doing an autism diagnosis, which is your son or daughter doesn't have autism. Like, well, no, or like they have is because of the vaccines. Here's what I get. Your son or daughter has autism. Doc, so I heard this thing about vaccines. I mean, I don't they're just trying to reach for it. And what I recommend to physicians and to the psychometricians, I say, here's my pat response is, so Adnan, we as experts in the field of autism actually do wish it was one thing. We wish it was vaccines. We wish it was gluten. We wish it was red dye. We wish it was mercury. Here's why, because if it was one thing that caused autism, we'd get rid of autism in a generation. It goes away. We know it's a hyper complicated mix of genetics, environment, pre and perinatal exposure, chromosomal neurology. We know it's a bunch of things. Now, every year we get a little bit closer to figuring it out. Like we have some more evidence that the Y chromosome carries. So it's probably dad, not mom, that it maybe some of this will be transmitted to. But we really don't have one thing. We actually wish it was, but we know it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 things that cause it. Because they're usually asking that question, is like, hey, did I cause this, Dr. Adnan? And you can pretty clearly say, no, if you did cause it, you need to let us know how, because then we can figure out how autism is caused. That's like none of us know. And so it's that's my usual response to that, because it is kind of frustrating. But I also clear it with autism is now at this point being destigmatized as a mental illness. It's more of a neurodiversity, right? And it's really, I really love working with kids and families with autism. They're very enjoyable. They're very fun. Not that I don't like working with other types of kids. These kids just really are a blast and is really fun. Now for an older, like it doesn't go away. It used to be called a pervasive developmental disorder, and that's a good way to think about it. Because I'll also hear this, Dr. Adnan, he has autism at school, but not at home. It's not how you can't shut it on and off. Trauma response may do that. Like they may get more triggered at school than at home, and that's a good kind of differential. But autism is not my uncle's left shoulder. Like, and when it gets rainy out there, it's cold. This left autism just flares right up. I don't know, it flares right up. This gets a little autistic, and like that's not how it works. Okay? But for one of the things we look at to go to your diagnostic question is the short answer is age and language ability. Those are good cues for diagnostics, because your social communication demands are really different when you're 3 than when you're 17, right? So we have the gold standard for assessing for autism is the ADOS second edition, Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. It's broken down into 5 modules: toddler, 1, 2, 3, 4. So those are 5 total. They're separate modules. And that's what they look at. Like, where's your language at? So if you have only a couple of words, or you don't have any identifiable language, and you're 36 months or older, we're probably going to use a module 1. Okay. The ADOS goes down cognitively 12 months. So we want to see kind of, because kids before 12 months of age often probably look like they have some of the signs of autism. It just may be that they're 6 months, right? Like their eye contact is weird. They may not do a social smile. So the module 1 looks a lot like you're playing with the kid, because you're looking for those social communication behaviors. And it's a pretty conservative measure in the sense that it gives you a bunch of chances to do one thing, because it's looking for certain key social communication behaviors that are problematic for people with autism. So response to name. So if I said Adnan, and you look up, and that doesn't tell me anything, but if Michael, that's a good cue, right? That you can respond to name, hearing notwithstanding. That changes as you get older. So we put a lot of weight on, because even if you have autism, you can kind of figure it out, right? As you get older, like, oh, I'm supposed to look at my dad when he calls my name. So I talk with people when they have like teenagers or adults. I talk about this is something my language is not in the ADOS. I'm going to be very clear about that. I call it the comic con test, the comic convention test. Here is a neurotypical comic convention test. 2 men who do not have autism. Adnan, Batman all the way. Are you high, Michael? Man, Superman ripped his head off. No, it wasn't, because remember in Hush arc, he said that Superman is Clark. Clark's good, but he's bad. So, but like, what about Zod? Okay, yeah, we're talking about Zod now, Adnan. Because Zod's going to rip his head off, but maybe Bruce has this ping pong of conversation, right? This back and forth this rest we call reciprocal social communication in the ADOS assessment. Here is a ASD, even a mild ASD. There's probably more mild ASD comic conversation. Ready? Michael, Batman, all the way. Did you know, Adnan, that Batman's first appearance was in Detective Comics number 27? Yeah, they just a couple months ago, they had like the 1,000th issue of Detective Comics. That was pretty cool, man. I mean, this was really cool art. Did you know that Bill Finger and Bob Kane were the original creators, and that Bob Kane had most of the credit for it, and Bill Finger was ostracized for a number of decades? Yeah, I saw something on YouTube about that. It was cool. I really like Joker, man. He's my favorite bad guy. Joker was originally based on an Italian actor who was acting in the movie The Man who laughed, and it is what he used and what we think Heath Ledger used for Dark Knight. Yeah, that is really their way to be social. They're really trying. I think it's really adorable and endearing. I really love it for that reason. I'm like, you're so cool. I love you. But a lot of people, you can see how that would create a lot of friction, right? Okay. And so like, that's a way that that person is trying to be social. And it's just, this is all we figured out. I can just give you facts I learned. So the ADOS is a really good way to assess that. And it also makes sure that it's not like, oh, he's just geeky. Like actually Sheldon is a really bad example of autism in pop culture. He's actually a crappy example because his eye contact looks relatively good. He's like, he's just kind of a jerk, actually. Like there's actually people ask me some examples. Like I think Atypical on Netflix. The Good Doctor actually isn't bad. The Good Doctor, if you've ever seen that, it's not awful. If I use a clip in training for autism, the one clip I actually use is the Henry Cavill Man of Steel movie when he's a kid and he's hearing all the sensory information and he's in the closet, in the janitor's closet, and it's just hurting him and it's so painful and he doesn't know what to do. Yeah, that's probably like the shortest clip, like short of like a series, like Atypicality of like what it looks like. And so last thing I'll say is when I give an autism diagnosis, I'm very clear to tell families, whatever dreams you have for your kid, keep having them. Don't close any doors you don't have to. Like if you think they're going to get married, yeah, people with autism get married. They're going to go to college. Heck yeah. They're going to have a family. They're going to be independent. Like you don't, because some of them are like, well, I have to put them in a home. Why? Nothing in our evaluation says that. And often people who do have autism who end up like in residential care or something because of their disability often have a lot of other things. Like they may have traumatic brain injury or cerebral palsy. Like they just physically can't move. So it doesn't have to do with their autism, why they're in a home. It's like they have no motor control. And they have a 35 IQ, which will probably need someone to take care of them or assist them throughout, a large. But we can still have them have, as much normalcy as possible. So whatever dreams you have, it's not, please don't cut off anything. That's not part of the ASD diagnosis of the autism spectrum. And I think that's becoming much more pronounced. There's been a much better movement within the autism treatment field, but also with people who have ASD being more empowered. Like, no, we are human beings and we just think differently. We have different brains and different perspectives. Yeah, you do. And we need to, I think a big part of hopefully the next part of our 21st century is we can have different perspectives and still live on the same planet. I think people with ASD have totally figured it out. I think maybe we as the neurotypical people have a little bit more work to do.
There's a lot of like incredible things. I don't know all the proper terminology, but for example, people refer to them as savants. What leads to some people who have autism developing these almost like superhuman qualities in certain areas of life?
Yeah, the short answer is we have no idea. That's the short answer. The longer answer is it's actually really rare. I know in Hollywood has really made that like that's the common thing. You get superpowers. Probably the worst example I've seen of this. I laughed through this whole movie. Someone told me to watch it because I do autism work. It's a movie called Chocolate. It's a martial arts film, and like what it's basically essentially this girl has autism. She likes chocolate, so I think chocolate. And when her autism kicks in, she literally kicks everyone's butt. Like she fights ninjas and Yakuza and Triad. And I'm like, I don't think I've seen that savant ability yet in the DSM or the ICD, but we need to put that in there, man. And so the only person who can touch her, literally the only person who can touch her is another kid with autism who apparently knows capoeira or something. And I'm like, this is the craziest movie, and I wish they made it a comedy, but they didn't. And it was they tried to like, oh, autism makes you so that idea is just all over the place, and it's a pretty it's not an accurate representation. It does happen though. One of our parent support on good autism teams, you'll see things like psychologist, physician, occupational therapist, speech path. Good autism teams have a parent representative there, someone who's a parent of a kid with autism or a disability. And one of the first one I ever worked with, name was Dwayne, like hilarious guy. He had 4 kids with autism. All 4 had a different type. So one kid looked relatively neurotypical. Another kid looked really impaired. A third kid was a savant. He had one kid who was a savant. They all had relatively different parts of the spectrum. And I think people think spectrum is you're low on the spectrum, you're better. You're more normal. No. it's more like planets, like where are they orbiting, like around normalcy, like, they change. And so the spectrum almost like a color wheel, like you can have like green all the way, red sucks. Like, no, that'd be weird to say about a color spectrum, right? And so ASD is more like that than like, okay, lower is good, higher is bad. Not that. That's not how the autism spectrum works. Dwayne's kids are a good example. Like, oh man, he's a literal savant. This kid has a ton of trouble with social skills. Like, that's what's really impactful. He's not impaired like he's hurting himself. Just, man, it's really hard. This kid, relatively okay, and things like that. And so we do see that, but we really don't. And the research reason is we don't have a large enough like sample size to kind of go back and look at that. But there are some people who do look at that. And the best guess we have is it's also helpful for us in the etiology. What causes autism is that maybe autism is a little bit more, like some kind of other phenomenon on the planet where, like if we talk about this is just completely different subtype, like with completely different neurology, completely different genetics, completely different things like that. We can still use the word autism, like we use the word like a cold, right? Like, so a cold could be anything, right? But, and it could function very differently at a viral or bacterial level. But yeah, we still call it a cold. Like, well, no, it's actually a bacteria. I'm just calling it cold. It's like, great. And it can represent a lot of different things. We just haven't been able to identify that enough, at least to my knowledge. But it's a fascinating topic for anyone who's interested. And I would encourage anyone watching, if I don't want to make it seem like, well, if you study kids who are only savants and have ASD, you're wasting your time. I think it's really cool. I think it'd be really cool to do that. I know some people do, but it's just trying to find them and identify them, and is a little tough actually for that.
Due to neurodiversity and differences away from neurotypicality, such as even like Elon Musk, in what circumstances would you treat a person for differences away from a sort of neurotypical state? Is it just when they're impaired, or would even individuals who are pretty high performers benefit from being treated for differences in neurotypicality?
You kind of hit on the question that kind of is a really hot topic right now in a good way, because it was kind of ignored. And I'll give you kind of the example where I kind of first encountered it when I was doing undergrad, like doing my undergrad psychology. We watch like Finding Nemo and Diagnose the Fish, right? It's like okay, like, oh, he has PTSD and they're alcoholics, and and it was not, and we just diagnose our family like, you must have narcissistic personality, and it's a fun pastime for undergrads in psychology. But there's a kind of an enmeshing that has that, like, as a professional psychologist, you want to make sure you stay away from. So it's what is typical, what is not, because that is very different than what is impairing and what is not, and that's kind of what you're hitting on. And so one of my colleagues who and I actually, like, I don't know, like, not in terms of ASD, but like ADHD, trauma. People with trauma are also actually starting to identify as not neurotypical, and I think that is neurologically accurate. For a lot of those of us who have our lived experience, especially chronic trauma across early childhood and into adulthood. And one of my friends who does have a lot of lived experience with trauma and identifies as not neurotypical, I love the way she phrases it, because she says, neurotypicality is atypical. Which I'm like, I think that's a fair assessment of the world. And it's like neurotypicality is the new, like neurodiversity is the new neurotypicality. Like all of us have some type of level of this. And so now the question becomes, back to what you said, like in the Elon Musk example. So is it impairing or not? And that actually is a much more complicated question than we initially thought, because it's like some of them is pretty clear. You're using drugs, boom, that's an easy. You get in the door real quick, or like you're cutting or suicidal. There's a gentleman called Thomas Lynch who is the developer of radically open dialectical behavior therapy, and he does credit Marshall Linehan, the developer of DBT, as the kind of originator. He's like part two, he's like the sequel. But he has a fascinating kind of take on what your question is for impairment, because sometimes we have maybe like an Elon Musk. He seems to be doing fine. So we probably like, no, you're good. You don't need to. But we're going to swing back to Elon in a second. And so let's say that you're not impaired, like ostensibly impaired. But so here's the kind of population that Dr. Lynch works with is 35-year-old Caucasian female, partner at her law firm, got her JD at 29, right? Made partner at 34, did 7-figure income, condo, house in the Hamptons, suicidal at 36. because she never resolved her child. She had 10 years of child emotional abuse by her father. So, and you see this in trauma families where one's like the burnout and then one's like the varsity 4.0, National Honor Society, summa cum laude, and they go the exact opposite. If people who are familiar with like structural family therapy know what this is, or Virginia Satir, that you'll understand this is what they were talking about back then. And so one of the, I think, contribution Lynch has is that like success doesn't mean health. So instead of impairment, we're looking at health. And that kind of changes the conversation a little, because that person is successful, but not really healthy. There was a recent article in ProPublica off some literature that's been around for a while, but no one's really paid a lot of attention to it, except people like me and my crew. It's called the John Henryism. John Henryism, those of you who are watching right now, type that in. Not John Henry effect, but John Henryism is the title of the article in ProPublica was How COVID-19 Hollowed Out a Generation of Young African-American Men. Because the fatality rates for African-American and some Latinx men look really different than their Caucasian counterparts. And one of the researchers at Johns Hopkins in that ProPublica article talks about skin deep resilience. And here's the example. Take a 40-year-old African-American PhD, house, spouse, 2 kids, no criminal record, no drug problem. No, he's not even impaired like that 35-year-old woman, no childhood trauma, nothing. Okay. Caucasian man with the exact same demographic info, PhD, housing, same amount of money, income, same number of kids, everything. Now they look successful according to our external outcomes of, money, SES, criminal record, alcoholism, and drug use. Okay, now strap a blood pressure cuff. Caucasian man, you're good. African American, you're pre-hypertension. Okay, take a blood draw. Caucasian man, fine, see you in a year. African American man, you're pre-diabetic, your telomeres are all shot, and we're worried you got this really high risk for this particular type of colon cancer. And the idea is that the effects of systemic racism, because that African-American PhD grew up in Mississippi and spent most of his life being oppressed by systemic racist culture. He had to get to college, went to Ole Miss, got his bachelor's, then went to Harvard, got his master's. All of that, and just being not a minority individual, they're starting to do more of this research like on Latinx, Native American, that has not resulted not in impairment, not in abnormality, but your health. Like your cost was getting out of that, the cycle of systemic racism and oppression that exists in this country is literally costing you your health. There's a disturbing stat like that is in the ProPublica article that African-American men have they lose 5 years. They saw if they're with John Henryism. And it's one of the leading explanations of why COVID-19 rates are looking so much different for that population. Even when you factor in healthcare access, SES, but even that, they're yeah, that explains some of it, but there's this huge chunk we don't know. And so if you just looked at normality or impairment, no, they're actually doing pretty good, on both of those. But if we look in terms of health, that's a little bit different, right? Which kind of goes back to Elon Musk, which is, I think there's an article that was published literally at the turn of the century in 2000 by Martin Seligman, who was incoming president of American Psychological Association. Martin Seligman is one of the founding fathers of what's called positive psychology. My alma mater, KU, it's one of the fountainheads of positive psych. Rick Snyder, Psychology of Hope, Shane Lopez, who was past president of positive psychology. And the article was called Towards a Positive Psychology. And I'm putting a little bit of words in Dr. Seligman's mouth, but here was kind of the gist. And it was very formative in my career because at the first decade of the century, that's when I was doing most of my training in psychology. Here's kind of the gist of the article. I would advise anyone who's interested in what I'm about to say, read this article because he does it in a diplomatic way, but it is kind of snarky. And he didn't create friends with this article in some ways, but those of us who were students loved him. He was like a rock star to us. Here's why, because here's how it starts. All right, clinical psych, awesome job. PTSD, panic, even depression, anxiety, man, you are rocking it with all this clinical stuff. You're focusing on DSM stuff. Good job. Is that all you got? Is that it? Are we ER docs for the brain and that's it? We just take out 9mm slugs? Is it? What happened to William James looked at spirituality? What happened to Abraham Maslow, who thought we could self-actualize, be the best us we could be? Carl Jung thought we could start understanding the secrets of the universe within our own consciousness. That's it? We're going to settle for this? We're taking out 9mm slugs? So it was, you can see why he created some, like we've been doing it all. Like, no, he wasn't dismissing the work. He was saying that you don't stop at pathology. A good psychologist doesn't stop at pathology. Like, well, you're not hurting anyone and you're not like, now if you are, we got to start there. That's our bottom level. Like if you are cutting or suicidal, and most of my colleagues, this is what we work on. But we have this radical idea, especially in the positive psychology framework, maybe you should be the best you. You don't have to be the best. You can just be the best admin. That's it. Like, what do you want to do? What are your dreams? And positive psychology are people like doing structural equation modeling on hope, cluster analysis on wisdom, these deep-seated things that most of us resonate with. And it's a big part of how I deal with burnout and secondary trauma, because it's not enough to tape you up. But what if we just give you something to look forward to? What if we tap you into that spiritual base that is part of your framework of you in the world? What if we, talk about wisdom, and what about resilience and faith and hope? And yeah, those are constructs that psychology should integrate. So even with Elon, let's say, I know he's kind of a controversial figure, but let's say Elon is like not hurting anyone, like he's good. Well, are you happy? And Tal Ben-Shahar out at Harvard has a book. It's called Happier. It's like 120 pages. It's the most popular course at Harvard University. And it's, how do you become happier? And it's actually a tricky question, right? Because it's like, Daniel Gilbert, who's a social psychologist, wrote a book called Stumbling on Happiness. And one of the key points is human beings suck at predicting what makes us happy. We really do, because we usually think it's monetary, tangible thing. Like, well, if I just get some more, get a raise, or like if I just meet the right person. It's like a lot of our happiness has to do with being uncomfortable sometimes, and like, engaging with our value. It has to do, you have to do a lot of, it's like being fit, being healthy. You are really uncomfortable. You eat food you hate, and you got to exercise, and you're sore all the time. So it's a very similar kind of parallel. And so even if we have so let's say we rule out that 36-year-old woman who's suicidal because she didn't deal with her trauma, but she's a partner. Let's say we rule out things like John Henryism, and that, we are able to catch these people in their 40s, these African-American, Latinx men, Native American men, and women who like, hey, let's get you some really good stuff so that we can prevent the diabetes. We can cut off the colon cancer at the pass. We don't have to do chemo or anything intrusive. We're still left with, well, like Martin Seligman, is that all you got, psychology? Let's stop there, just treat PTSD. Now, I am one of the people, I do treat PTSD, and I think it's a rewarding profession and career. So I'm not knocking that, because that would be very hypocritical, because that's most of what I do in any given day. But I also want to communicate that, yeah, we should probably not just, psychology shouldn't just be used for pathology. Psychology originally started as looking at the deepest aspects of what make us human and what makes humanity humane. And I think it's starting to return to that. I actually think the pandemic has expedited that, because, all of us have had a trauma in the last year. And it actually, for a lot of us, clarified what's important, what's valuable, and what makes us most human and what makes us most inhuman. So I'll stop there.